Go live. Oh my goodness. Click here to connect. 1 second. 1 second.
I like this platform a lot. This is really neat.
I love it. We're going live on YouTube right now. Hi, everybody. Welcome again to our next webinar. This is so awesome. My name is Dr. Azumah. I'm the host and moderator. You guys are here today for Love Your Menses and Your Health. This is a conversation with a sister doc. This is, I believe, our third webinar, and we're so excited to have a special sister doc with us, Dr. James. You're going to be hearing so much about her, but welcome again. Again, this information is brought to empower people because we have so many smart sister docs in the world. So we use this as a platform to encourage you.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, I'm your host. Let me elaborate about who I am. I'm Dr. Azumah. I'm a board-certified OBGYN. I'm a public health professional, and I love being a community health educator, and a social entrepreneur. I'm a founder of Healthy and Uplifted. I'm also the founder of Elevate Her Mind, the co-founder and president of Love Your Menses. I'm also a doula and a certified life coach. So I wear many hats because I like to be I like to help people, and I believe having multiple hats gives me the necessary tool to be of help. Just some disclaimers, okay? By participating in this event, you grant us permission to use your name, image, or electronic, okay? So we just wanted you to be aware of that. Again, you're going to be speaking to a lot of healthcare providers. We do not stand today as your healthcare provider. We stand today as educators, okay? Please collaborate with your healthcare provider in providing health. All right, so today we're going to start with my sister doc, Dr. Joette James. She completed her doctoral degree in clinical psychology at Northwestern University in Chicago, Illinois. She also completed her internship at Harvard Medical School / Boston Children's Hospital in Boston, Massachusetts. She then attended two-year postdoctoral fellowship in Pediatric Neuropsychology at Children's National Medical Center in Washington, D.C. And listen to this. After completing her postdoctoral fellowship, Dr. James is now a board-certified clinical neuropsychologist, yay! By the American Board of Professional Psychology. She currently serves on the DC Board of Psychology. She provides individualized clinical assessment for individuals of all ages with neurodevelopmental disorders, including autism spectrum disorder, ADHD, learning disability, and intellectual disability, as well for other individuals with acquired injuries to the brain. She also maintains a private clinic and a forensics consultation. So that is Dr. James. I'm going to now hand over the slides so that she can navigate this important conversation. Again, this conversation might be touchy for some people. Again, we don't mean to offend anyone, but as public health specialists, we know that cultural biases is recognized. And for us to heal as a community, we have to sometimes go through that wound and peel off those layers that prevents us from thriving. So I hope nobody would be offended by this conversation, but I really want to hear what Dr. Joette James has to say. I have my book and my pen to take notes. Here you go, Dr. James.
Thank you so much, Dr. Azumah. I really appreciate it. This is such an honor to be presenting for Love Your Menses. I met Dr. Azumah not that long ago, and we quickly wanted to collaborate on this. This is a really important topic. As Dr. Azumah said, I mostly work with children, and I also do forensic consultation and do evaluations of folks on the other end of this spectrum in the prison and jail system. And it's really heartbreaking to work on that end of things. And I think that it's important for us to do as much as we can to prevent the progression into that school to prison pipeline, which is very much a part of our culture and very much affecting people of color, particularly Black and brown children, and particularly those who have disabilities. So I'm going to talk some today, and this is a huge topic, and I am very, very chatty. So I'm going to try and keep this as tight as I can. And if there are any questions, I'm very happy to be able to answer them. This is, again, very near and dear to my heart. I also want to acknowledge Marcy Jackson, who we started doing this presentation a couple of years ago, initially to physicians and psychologists, and then to individuals in the community. And we continue to just be very invested in presenting about navigating cultural bias in education. Okay, so we're going to move to the first slide here, and this is really a glimpse of it's a cartoon, but really exemplifies what our education system is like. At the base, it's supposed to be a system that brings justice for everyone and provides appropriate free education according to the federal law to every child that is within the system. But we do know that, unfortunately, because of the ways in which racism and bias work at a systemic level, which I'm going to talk about in a moment, it isn't easy for everyone. It isn't equal for everyone. It's much harder for an elephant to climb a tree than a monkey. Much harder, I think, still for a fish in a fishbowl. So that education system in its ideal is there to serve everyone the same way, but it in fact doesn't, unfortunately. I think it's important to look at terms when we think about how systemic racism impacts our communities, and particularly in this area of education. During the pandemic, I did an amazing course called Racial Literacy 101. It was by Little Lights Urban Ministries, which is a nonprofit organization here in DC that provides tutoring and affordable housing, but they also do a 12-week training in anti-racism. And so some of this I took from them. I learned very much about, and I'm originally just, as I will say, I'm Canadian, and I think it was really a good opportunity for me to myself explore some of the things that I'd heard as a child, which are completely untrue. So when we think about race, it has traditionally been thought to have a biological or genetic basis, but we know that it does not. Right? We know that race is, in fact, a social and political construction. It has no basis in any kind of coherent biological reality, and it is a way of categorizing people to maintain a particular hierarchy. As a child, and I turned 50 this year, so this was a remarkable year for me. I'm still dealing with being 50, but I do recall that as a child, I was of a generation that learned in school that race was biological and ethnicity was more cultural. Ethnicity was about national origin, language, customs, and tradition, but race was biological. Well, we now know that to be completely untrue. And so what is racism then? As a social and political construction, we have race, and race is the ways in which there is a belief that there is a superiority of one's race and the inferiority of another. So it's a maintaining of a hierarchy that involves negative attitudes, feelings, and beliefs towards people that are perceived to be of a particular group, particular membership based on, again, physical characteristics that don't have a biological basis. Okay, so we get more complex when we think about racism, because we think we should really be thinking about racism in terms of outcomes, right? The ways in which it impacts us economically, culturally, sociologically, politically. It's not about intentions. It's really about the impact of this system on marginalized groups. And when we think about racism initially, most people do think about individual racism, what happens interpersonally, right? Individual behavior. And that it's the idea that there is individual behavior, the outcome of which reinforces this dominant, marginalized economic, cultural, sociological, and political paradigm. Again, we consider racism to exist regardless of the person's intentions, because people can act in a racist manner but do so unintentionally. But that's the level at which we mostly, until we really started talking more about the different aspects of racism, especially systemically and structurally, I think that was the way that much of talk about racism existed. It was really at this individual level, but we know it's much more than that. And that's why I think it's important to go through some of these other subtypes. We have internalized racism. So the ways in which attitudes that are racist become a part of the fabric of one's own psychological identity. In the African American tradition, has often been around color, just lightness versus darkness, dark skin versus light skin, and in discrimination and prejudices and racism that are based on this concept that lighter skin is better, more beautiful. That's an internalized racist concept that people carry with them. So it's a hierarchy, again, coming from another system, but then becomes a psychological internal reality. Interpersonal racism is what, again, we think of when we think of at the interpersonal or social individual level and groups, and it's how private beliefs come into interaction with others. Now we have it in this interpersonal realm. And we think of really hate groups, white supremacist groups, right? That's what comes to our mind when we think about interpersonal racism. But we need to think about these things in a larger framework. And I think that's when we start to think about education, and all of us know this, but I think it's important to articulate that this idea of institutional racism happens within and between institutions. And it includes unfair policies, and it has these differential opportunities and impacts. And that is an important concept to understand when we think about schools, but also when we think about what we see in the media, certainly in the criminal justice system. And that's my experience working in the criminal justice system. When we think about aspects of institutional racism, we think of things like housing practices, school segregation, redlining and denial of bank loans, exclusion from juries, and disproportionate punishments, again, often in the criminal justice system. When we have systemic racism, systemic or structural racism is that normalization of these dynamics that include all of these aspects: historical, cultural, institutional, and interpersonal, and generally are in a system where we're advantaging people who are white, while producing chronic adversity for people of color. So it's a system of hierarchy and inequity. So we have the different institutions, we have school, we have mass media, we have the housing market, and the system is how these all work and interact together. It's a preferential treatment system of power that disadvantages some and advantages others. Cultural racism is really about what we think of as beautiful. What is beautiful? And how do we define beauty in the context of our particular culture? And in a culture where we have racism as dominating, what is associated with whiteness is automatically better, more normal, more beautiful than those things that are part of the culture of other racially defined groups, right? And that trickles down. That is, we just talked about the mass media, but it also comes through advertising, books, what it means to be a patriot, and it impacts our policies and our laws, and it helps to justify laws and policies like racial profiling, because we really are thinking that certain groups are are more dangerous and are then we have a justification for targeting, for example, young Black men, and young Black men are thought to be looking like they're older and more dangerous. And there is a ton of research about that kind of profiling that we see that is a cultural racism fact. So again, it's what we see as it's a collective belief about what constitutes appropriate behavior and what is seen as beautiful and what kind of value is placed on particular groups of people. Some people are visual, so here's everything I was just talking about, but schematically drawn, so you can see that we focus often on the individual and interpersonal levels, but when we think of what is going on in our schools, and especially when we have a child with a disability that needs to traverse this system, we need to think about those institutional and structural levels. And again, we define this by outcome. Lots of folks have good intentions. It's not really about intentions, right? Because you can have racism with the best of intentions. I think it's important to talk briefly about racial trauma because that comes also into the school system when we think about how racial trauma is transmitted, both physical and psychological symptoms of anxiety, of depression, of negative self-image, and some of what we see when we talk about trauma is really in the sense of racism, almost like a post-traumatic stress disorder, or some of those symptoms that when people have experienced a natural disaster or interpersonal trauma, some of these same symptoms that we see there come to play in racial trauma. So there are the same symptoms of feeling anxious, the same feelings of having nightmares or hypervigilance. And we know that experience, that ongoing experience around racial trauma can also impact our health. I think this is, when we started looking at adverse childhood experiences, I think one of the most surprising findings was the extent to which not only emotional health was affected, but physical health. When children were exposed to traumas like sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, neglect, parents who had severe mental illnesses, parents who were incarcerated. What we were most surprised about was the long-term effects on things like cardiac function, on chronic illnesses like diabetes. We assumed that there would be a psychological effect, depression, anxiety, but really our body and mind are so connected that traumas can also impact our physical health. Okay. I want to also talk a little bit about, in that vein, of historical racial trauma. So this is trauma that is shared by a group rather than an individual and spans multiple generations. So these are transmitted through stories, through narratives, often through the family line, family dynamics, the ways in which family members act towards each other may be replaying that sense of trauma that was experienced multiple generations before. We think of the First Nations tribes. This is Canadian language, but we have the Native people who were forcibly removed from their land, and basically, a genocide that occurred there, and how that gets transmitted the same way that stories about slavery, about segregation, and the pain and psychological trauma associated with those, with single events, but also that chronic level of trauma, again, gets transmitted through families, and is another thing to just think about as people move about in the world. And again, particularly in children who have developmental disabilities, because they are even at more risk than a neurotypical child would be. And I'm going to see if I can make this work. And if I can't, oh, no. This was just a slide about racial trauma. but I'm not sure that I can make it work. So I can't make it work through this platform, but I will say I'm going to actually just go back a moment because I found this clip through, and you can take a screenshot of it. It's a wonderful, it's not that long. It's maybe about 10, 15 minutes that talks about the impact of racial trauma and also how to address it in the context of a school setting, making sure that that is part of a conversation, how racial trauma affects physical and emotional health and how it can impact a child in the school setting. It's the doctor that is talking about her name is Riana, R-I-A-N-A Anderson, and she's an assistant professor at the University of Michigan School of Public Health. So it's a wonderful little video to explore, just because we don't often talk about racial trauma. I mean, in fact, we probably never do in the context of the school setting, and we probably should more. Okay, so now that we've talked about different definitions of racism, how racism can impact at the structural level, at the systemic level, at the individual level, and also how it can impact cultural norms, sense of beauty, and can be transmitted through generations. We're going to talk about why that's important in the context of having a child with a developmental disability who's trying to navigate one of those institutions, and that's the educational system. And so who is valuable? When we think about education, we think about us living in a country where we have free and appropriate education for all, and particularly for the kids who need it the most, who are at the most risk, who have developmental disabilities, who have autism, who have learning disabilities, who have ADHD, and who need that help even more, right? And so this is, and I think we're going to get into why this is so important, but I think you can already think about this. I mean, our children are so precious, and we know that there is a real direct line from challenges in development to being disenfranchised in a system that doesn't always do what it should do, to that dropping out of school and that school to prison, school to jail pipeline. I have a colleague that is an attorney in Georgia who started a nonprofit that is really trying to get at the root of that by looking for volunteers, psychologists, mental health professionals, and also attorneys who can help at the point where children with disabilities and adolescents with disabilities, often of color, are at the point of being expelled, which is a critical inflection point, often expelled because of their disability, or should I say, the school looks at a particular behavior, maybe a violent or threatening behavior, and does not necessarily interpret it in light of their person's disability. And there may be biases associated with that because they're a child of color on top of that. And then they end up expelled. And we know from a research standpoint, when a child is expelled, when a child is disenfranchised from school, that is where the real danger for becoming involved in the criminal justice system begins. And so this is a nonprofit that he started to work at the level of what we call a manifestation hearing, which is the hearing that in the school system determines whether or not the behavior was a result of the disability. If we can show that the behavior was a result of the disability, then we prevent that child from going down that wrong path, and we can keep them in school. And so it's very near and dear to my heart. I've just been volunteering for them for a couple of months now, but it's so important, I think, to think about intervening early and often, because our kids with developmental disabilities are at continued risk. So it's really an important issue for all of us. These seem to be sort of no-brainers, right? But we want our kids to have good outcomes educationally, socially, emotionally. We want them to stay in school because we know that that's the pathway to success, and to have post-secondary opportunities And this is especially, again, critical for our kids with disabilities, both physical, psychological, developmental disabilities. We want them to develop good relationships and have good resources and to be able to use their strengths, to recognize and use their strengths. School should be a safe place, and it should be a place of growth, and it shouldn't be a place where you feel less than. And we want to prevent that. We know that African American children are consistently overrepresented in special education. When I first did this presentation, we were specifically looking at Maryland, but it's true across the country. And they're most likely to be identified as emotionally disabled or emotionally disturbed. When that category fits, that's fine. We have many kids, again, who have seen abuse, have seen neglect, who have maybe particular histories of multiple foster homes, who have conditions where they do have a lot of severe behavior dysregulation, and they need that emotional disability special education code. But unfortunately, we have a lot of children, particularly children of color and particularly boys of color, who are improperly put in that emotional disability category and really seen as bad kids, when there could be, for example, a reading disability going on that's untreated, or there could be autism that's going on and that's untreated. And this is, again, due to these systemic biases and stereotypes about children of color. So we want to make sure that we address that issue, again, in the context of this school system. We've talked about racism already, but again, it's this, we're gonna move past that. And there's disparity, again, in how Black students and white students are identified in the special education context. It's disparaging, but I know that we all can do something about that. We know that Black students are 40% more likely to be identified as having educational disabilities, and they're, as I said, twice as likely to be identified as having emotional disturbance. And another category that is overrepresented is also intellectual disability. So intellectual disability is another area in which children of color are overrepresented. And children among families of students with disabilities, those with lower incomes, and who have children of color are less likely to be identified as being able to access their legal rights under IDEA, which is the special education law. That's federal special education law. It's the Individuals with Development, I think, Disabilities Education Act, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA. So we have a lot that unfortunately is going against us. But again, we have good news about the ways in which I think just educating ourselves about these problems and really thinking about how we can correct them is so important, and how these forces of systemic racism happen at every level. And we're going to talk about that. They happen at the level of referral, they happen at the level of assessment, and they also happen at the level of treatment and diagnoses. Again, I just talked about an aspect of diagnosis in the system where kids are given the wrong diagnosis or the wrong special education code. But it happens at every level, even from being able to be taken seriously by physicians, by my medical colleagues, by pediatricians. Parents of children of color are more likely to be dismissed when they express concerns to their pediatrician, told, oh, he's just a boy, it's fine, he'll develop social skills, it's not a big deal, when there is a real problem that's being identified by the parent and they're just not being taken seriously. Okay, so disproportionality is this idea that a group's representation in a particular category exceeds expectations for that group or differs substantially from the representation of others in that category. So the earliest publication about that was in 1968. Lloyd Dunn published an article noticing that there was an overrepresentation of Black students and students from low incomes in special day classes for what we then called mild mental retardation, what we now call intellectual disability. And that was one of the first and well-known articles that cited this disproportionality in education. So we knew that it existed, and it's existed for a long time. And this can start as early as infancy. So now, fortunately, we are starting to see more closing of that gap through programs like Head Start and early preschool programs, Title I programs. We are identifying infants and preschoolers somewhat better than we used to, particularly for conditions like autism spectrum disorder. That's the good news. But there still continues to be an achievement gap between Black and white kids that starts as early as infancy and continues up into graduation. And that continues to be true in the literature, and we see that. There's also an under representation of children of Black children in giftedness programs. So they are less likely to be referred to a giftedness program. So, and I deal with that on a regular basis. I have had some clients who have extraordinarily gifted children, and they're not referred to gifted programs. And instead, the child, because of their giftedness, is doing things that like they're correcting the teacher or they're bored and they're acting up in class. And that's the behavior that gets focused on. Doesn't get focused on the fact that they're actually gifted, and that some of these behaviors may be a result of their giftedness. But where we have, implicit bias seeping in is that this is a bad kid or a troubled kid, right? When that's not the case. And so these are just some statistics here that again, re-emphasize some of the points I was making around school-age children, particularly, as you can see the bottom of that chart there, 6 to 21. They're much, much more likely to be identified as having an intellectual disability or an emotional problem, emotional disturbance. And we also know that young Black children are much less likely to receive early intervention. So we have that kind of starting out. Now, here's where we get to discipline, which is incredibly concerning. And we see that this is a slide that just shows some data on race and disabilities. What happens often, in addition to just as you can see from the chart, the vast disproportionality in terms of school suspension. So the likelihood to be suspended at least once. If you are Black with a disability, 1 in 4 versus 1 in 20 for a child who is white. We also see these harsher disciplinary practices and differentiation in how discipline happens. So, for example, students of color are much more likely to be disciplined for more vague infractions that aren't well defined. Things like being disrespectful or disturbing others, which again are not very well defined terms, whereas white children are more likely to be disciplined for concrete infractions like skipping school, using drugs, right? So there is a sense in which there's a fuzziness of how we think about children of color, which leads to a greater likelihood of being punished, and also we know punished more harshly. So these punishments are not operationally defined, and that is very problematic, obviously. This is what concerns me the most, and this is what I see on the other side of what I do. I do a lot of work on death row, evaluating folks who are on death row, and death row is a very sad place. It's not sexy. It's not filled with, folks from 48 hours or 60 minutes. It's not filled with Ted Bundy's or Charles Manson's. It's filled with folks who have mental illness, who are poor, and who are usually Black or brown. That's what death row looks like. It is, and who have also had horrifically traumatized lives. So again, we have this school to prison pipeline, and we have a much higher, just in general, of folks with disabilities headed down that pipeline, but certainly much more, especially with individuals of color who are headed in that direction. And part of that, again, is the continuation of what we saw on the slide just before. When you are more harshly disciplined, there are more suspensions, and that leads to juvenile detentions, which then lead to it leads to disenfranchisement with school. It leads to the beginning of starting to skip school, attendance problems, hanging out with kids who are in trouble already, and who are likely in trouble in the criminal justice system. Most adolescents, when they commit crimes, the vast majority do so together. They don't commit crimes as individuals, they do so as groups. So that when a child and when an adolescent does not have an appropriate group to be with, and they are not connected emotionally, academically with the school system, then they are much more likely to slip into this pipeline. And out of school suspensions are particularly important to note, and those are particularly higher in children of color versus white children. We know just in general that high school outcomes are far lower for students with disabilities. And again, this is why it's so important that we really attend particularly to our students with disabilities, because they're much more likely to drop out of school out of frustration. That's also leading to that school to prison pipeline. If folks do not receive adequate services, and school is a child's job. Imagine going to your job every day and not having the support that you need, not feeling skilled, not feeling confident, then it becomes a miserable place. And this in general leads to, for students with disabilities, to a higher dropout rate, but it's even more so for our Black students with disabilities. And there are, of course, workforce implications. If you have a disability, you're less likely to receive a bachelor's degree, and unemployment rates are much higher in people of color. So we have these statistics that show us that, again, when we think about systems, and early on I talked about systemic racism, we see how ways in which these systems overlap, and that one problem can easily slip into another, and which is why we need to be so cognizant of how we are addressing and navigating bias when it comes to our kids with disabilities. We also know that Hispanic and Latinx students are overrepresented in special ed. And this is particularly true around language issues. So we have bilingual students who are much more likely, disproportionately, to be diagnosed with a speech and language disorder than a white student. And that is, again, related to biases and expectations, especially very low expectations for bilingual students, or not understanding the course of bilingualism. Bilingualism has a developmental course, a typical bilingualism and code switching and all of that kind of those processes that happen, that has a developmental course that is typical, that is normal. And so what happens is, if you don't understand that and you have biases about someone's linguistic abilities, then they're more likely to be seen as having a speech and language disorder and put into classes which are not appropriate, or diagnosed with a learning disability when English is in fact not their first language. It's very different from having a language-based learning disability and not being proficient in the language because it's not the language that is your native language or the one that you're most exposed to. There are ways of sorting through that through good testing, through culturally appropriate testing, where we have children tested in their native language and English, where there are different norms, where you have ways of determining acculturation and how long someone has been in the country, the extent to which they have adopted a culture and can and are functioning in that culture and linguistically doing so as well. There are proper ways to assess proficiency in language. But if you go to someone, if your child goes to someone who doesn't have that proficiency, then they can be easily misdiagnosed. Why does this happen? Well, we know again that there are that African American students are often, and students of color in general, they're more harshly disciplined. They're excluded from the learning process, and those kids that are are not included or excluded from the learning process are more likely to disengage. There's subjectivity in the placement decisions. Decisions are often made upon personal judgments versus academic performance. And there's variability in the quality of instruction and bias assessment practices. Race and class of students with disabilities often affects how teachers and clinicians interact with them, how they assess them, how they listen to their parents. And then there are low expectations, low quality of services, and perpetuation of these stereotypes. So there are many reasons why this disproportionality takes place, and that is related to these systems. And I'm going to briefly talk about implicit bias. So implicit bias referring to attitudes or stereotypes that affect understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner, right? So these can be both favorable and unfavorable assessments. They can be stereotypes that say, oh, you know, Asian students are smarter and they're supposed to perform better, or biases about the intellectual ability of an African American child. They can be positive, they can be negative, but they are outside of the person's awareness or intentional control, but they actually affect how that person functions. And we think about this particularly in this context in education, how teachers' expectations matter. And children as young as 6 can recognize when their teachers and people in general hold stereotypes, and students react and respond to perceived expectations, and they will change their behavior. And we all know this with children, those of us who have children, how they can act differently with different people. Very early age, they learn how to get around, they learn to, and this is true of our children with disabilities as well. They are sensitive. Children are sensitive to how they are treated, how they are perceived, and they will change their behavior based on these biases conforming to them, whether they're positive or negative. We have racial bias that occurs in the process of assessment. Assessment is what I do. It's what I do all day long. And we know now that, you know, the long-standing discrepancies between IQ scores between African Americans and white examinees. This is decreasing, by the way, that discrepancy, but we know that, of course, it's not due to race. It's likely mediated by things like socioeconomic status and education. So right when we have higher levels of education, there's better neuropsychological performance, better performance on intellectual tasks. It's a complex issue. Because quality of education also factors in there. And we know that traditionally African Americans have had a poorer quality of education, and, you know, in terms of textbooks and just availability of things like microscopes and computers, and have been more likely to be exposed to environmental hazards like lead and asbestos in school systems. So we often use education as a proxy for socioeconomic status. It's a complicated issue, but we do know that these discrepancies are not based on race. They're actually based on these other mediating factors like socioeconomic status and education. Another problem that we have is in many of our tests, we don't have, now this is less true for children and less true for the larger tests that we have as neuropsychologists. I can attest to that, like intellectual tests. Those tests are normed and standardized, meaning that when they're created, they're developed using large groups of people from different groups, from different income levels, different ages. So we can trust those tests just as themselves, the structure of those tests. Now, you know, there are biases in terms of the person giving that test. That's another thing to talk about. But those tests themselves are typically, you know, fine in terms of not having bias. But, you know, when we look at standardization samples, especially for questionnaire measures, so questionnaire measures about behavior, there are cultural differences in perception of behavior and understanding of behavior, and those can show up as problematic in some of those questionnaire measures. So we need to be kind of always on the lookout of that, because we know that, and this is true not just in psychology, frankly, but in all of medicine. One that just pops into mind, I was reading an article about a year ago about just hairstyles and being able to be imaged in an MRI. If you have braids, if you have, thicker hair, if you have an afro, you're not going to be able to get in that MRI as easily. And honestly, there is no accommodation made for that. There's sort of a one size fits all. And as a result, then what we have are discrepancies in medical values and research, and not really representing particular groups very well. And then we have decisions that are made medically on inappropriate data. So it isn't just a psychology thing, but certainly in psychology, it impacts us the most when it comes to assessment, because we have tests that are, I can think of a few that come to mind, again, mostly for adults, that are absolutely ridiculous, that were developed on 15 adolescents in Minnesota, and then are applied to, I'm exaggerating, but then are applied more widely and are clearly not representative. And that's a problem. This is the problem from the other side. So I just talked about, the tests themselves, and sometimes then we have good tests. We have some tests that are well structured, well normed, well standardized, but then we can have what's called stereotype threat, which is that when there's a mismatch between the tester and the person being tested, there can be changes in that person's functioning and performance on the test based simply on the fear of being judged based on a negative stereotype. So it's, again, almost like an internalized racism when someone takes on that negative stereotype that comes to life in the context of being assessed, being tested. And we see this phenomenon in IQ. We see it in other kinds of testing that I do as a neuropsychologist: attention testing, memory testing, executive functioning, academic tests like reading and math, and also work performance. Interestingly, the stronger the person's racial identity and sense of self, the less likely this stereotype threat will happen. So that gives us a lot of positives to think about in terms of identity and developing a strong sense of who you are as a person, how you fit within a community and a culture. When you have that strong sense of identity, then this effect is less likely to take place. Again, when we look at a neuropsychological assessment in different languages, we need to hang our head in shame a little bit. We don't have a lot of providers who do developmental screening in Spanish. We do have probably more tests in Spanish than we do in other languages. But again, remember, it's not just language, it's acculturation. It's also where people are from. Spanish in Spain is very different from the Spanish in Mexico. So again, there are complexities there in terms of culture. It's not just language. But Spanish language parents, again, face what African Americans do, is that they're less likely to be asked about any concerns they might have about their developing child, even when that child is at risk for a developmental delay. So they're just not being questioned about what might be going on, and they feel as though they're not being listened to by providers or given the information they need to make good decisions on what they need to do. Why do we care about this? We care about it for many reasons, but one complication here is that there is so much overlap, so much comorbidity between different disorders. Reading disorder, we have there in the middle, the RD, but then we have autism spectrum disorder. We have ADHD, we have speech and language impairment, SLD, or specific learning disabilities, conduct disorder, oppositional defiant disorder, anxiety, depression. These all tend to go together. And so even without all the complexities that we're talking about in terms of systemic racism and implicit bias and expectations, we still have this problem of making a proper diagnosis. So, it's almost like, it's just one more step that we have to get over. Again, I want this to be positive in its thrust, and I know I'm giving you a lot of negative, but hopefully we see these problems and then we can do something about them, because I think there's a lot that we can do. This is very specific to autism, and autism is very much having a moment right now, really having a zeitgeist right now, which is good. I think there's much less stigma about autism than there was when I started practicing 20 years ago, but we still have some problems in terms of race-based bias. We have fewer Black children receiving a first diagnosis of autism after the age of 6. So as I said earlier, we are doing much better for younger children in autism. But what happens is if the child is over 6 and their symptoms are milder, so maybe they have a little bit of pedantic language, maybe they're a little rigid and have trouble with transitions, maybe they're a little bit they have a little bit socially awkward, right? They don't have the full presentation of autism, the sort of classic presentation of autism that people think about, that lay people think about. If they're more subtle, they're less likely to be diagnosed. They're more likely to be missed. And again, we know that there are lots of reasons for that, but there are a number of race-based reasons in terms of misinterpretation of behaviors, not listening to parents, not having access to some of these specialty clinics, like the Center for Autism Spectrum Disorders. When I first came to DC and I was a postdoctoral fellowship at Children's, we have a Center for Autism Spectrum Disorders. It's a specialty clinic. Well, again, there are issues of insurance, even knowing that clinic exists, being able to access that. So as children age out of early intervention, which has become much better and a much bigger safety net for children who are at risk, especially children of color at risk, then what happens is as they get older, they slip out of that net and they're not caught, especially for autism. Also, we see that with Hispanic and Latinx children, they're much less likely to be diagnosed with autism, and they're actually less likely to be diagnosed than Black children. And again, we have all of the issues that you can imagine, the stigma around the condition, a lack of education around the condition. If you have someone who English is not their primary language and they're seeking out services, being able to access the services. Unfortunately, most clinics aren't bilingual. It just really causes a problem. And we know that with developmental disorders, especially autism, early intervention is key. All right, so what do we do? Okay, so this is all the bad news, and then now we got the good news. So what can we do? Well, we need to develop cultural competence. Obviously, that's really important. We need to really learn about the ways in which cultural bias, and hopefully I've explained some ways in which cultural biases can impact at the level of referral, at the level of diagnosis, at the level of punishment and sort of discipline, treatment, diagnoses. And so, we want to really think about how then can we really right that wrong. So part of that is awareness and just understanding about how these impacts occur. And then we really think about how do we make sure that there are services that are responsive and sensitive to our children. So that also includes developing culturally responsive curriculum. And I think that we are always thinking about this when it comes to kids with disabilities in general. How do we teach them in a way that is corresponds to their strengths, right? We always think about multiple viewpoints or ways of accessing knowledge and information. How do we teach our kids so that it's not just a single method, right? But that we take into account different ways of thinking that are that go beyond a dominant way, and that we develop these curriculums that we really address some of these stereotypes and distortions. I think, it is, again, education, but particularly the folks who are on the front lines. We need to give parents of color more access to information, especially to information about developmental disorders, what they look like over time, what subtle symptoms of autism look like, rather than more classic symptoms of autism. We've started to have more conversations about how autism presents in different genders, but we really need to be providing more of that information so that kids are not missed, particularly in community settings of parents of color, so that they have that access. And providing good quality support to parents and caregivers. Navigating the special education process is difficult. And in some systems, they have folks that are like buddies, that really parents who have been through it already. I think parents who have been through the system are probably the most valuable resource that I know. Even for me as a psychologist, you have a parent who has been there, who've gone to IEP meetings, who have found ways of expressing their concerns to pediatricians, to psychologists, who stand up for themselves in team meetings, who've engaged special education advocacy, either for themselves. I've had parents who've actually been through the process, and then they themselves have become advocates. And there are a couple of advocacy organizations that I really strongly recommend that do this as well. Just having people on your side as you navigate this, it can help get around some of these cultural bias pitfalls. And there have been some really interesting programs. There's a Maryland study on African-American boys that talks about, incorporating, for example, rites of passage, and really addressing specifically some of the problems that African-American boys face. Recruiting teachers, of course, that are of color, who can really, work with boys and their particular needs that they might have, but really how that takes these, statistics about learning disabilities and intellectual disabilities in African-American boys, and kind of works into the curriculum ways of teaching our kiddos and integrating cultural values. I think that's going to be really, really important. And just taking this general anti-racist stance, that we're not being passive. I think that the thing that I got most out of the course that I took was that it's about being active. It's recognizing that, these issues exist, but really taking action in terms of education and communication and really helping. I think, again, as I said, helping each other and really dismantle these systems that are dysfunctional and cause problems for our kids and for all of us, but especially the ones that are most at risk. And those are, the kiddos near and dear to my heart, as kids who are struggling with disabilities, and recognizing that they have incredible strengths that need to be utilized, and that we're actually actively thinking about how we leverage strength in the context of challenge. All right, I just wanted to, I'm at the end, but I wanted to, again, recognize Marcy Jackson, who has an online staff training. This is through the Weinfeld Educational Group. They are one of my favorite special education advocacy groups in the District, Maryland, and Virginia area. They have an online course that is specifically about identifying and removing obstacles for Black students with special needs that can be used as a training, but they also have an advocacy service, and this is not income-based. This is what's really cool about this. This is not an income-based service. It's specifically looking at children of color who have not received the advocacy services that they need. And it's providing low-cost advocacy services. And they've done some wonderful work with students with a variety of disabilities. So I highly recommend WEG, Weinfeld Education Group in general, but also this particular program called See Us, SEES, that provides low cost and sometimes free advocacy for families of children of color. All right, I think I'm done. Thank you so much. Here's my info. Here's how to reach Marcy. And Dr. Azumah, thanks again for having me today.
Wow, thank you so much for that information that you've provided. It was phenomenal. It's just a lot of thought-provoking comments, at least thoughts. And I was just taking notes and thank you for the story, starting with racism and then going to autism and then solution. It was just well outlined. Again, I guess you're Dr. James. So
Right.
I'm really, I'm really grateful. It was just well done because um, it seems when we talk about neurodivergence,
Mhm.
especially within Black and Brown culture, we have to start with racial inequalities.
Mhm.
Uh, it- you know, a lot of people don't want us to talk about racial discrimination and inequalities because it's negative. It brings bad blood. We've moved past it. So, how can we say, yes, we want to be positive, but we want to really identify the root cause of problems so that we can fix it? How do you justify it? Because this, when we talk about racism, people don't want to hear that. Even, I'm sorry, even amongst Black people, they want to move
Yeah.
past it. So,
Yeah.
yeah, so what's your take? What's
I
your
mean,
take?
again, I don't, it's here, it still exists. I think it's important just simply to recognize that even when we think of the way we think of racism needs to change, and it's been changing, right? I think we need to think about the sort of baked in laws and policies that impact how people of color are treated within different systems, like the educational system, like the criminal justice system. So first of all, it just starts with awareness, knowing that that it can happen at the level of referral, that it can happen at the level of assessment, at diagnosis, at treatment, right? How disciplinary practices are affected. So that's what I've presented about today. So we need to know that it exists, know that it happens. And then when we have our own children with developmental disabilities, particularly children who are neurodiverse, as they move through this system, again, we don't want to start out in an adversarial fashion, right? We want to assume the best about people, so we don't go in there with negative attitudes or with an angry sort of focus, but we are constantly, I mean, I always tell parents, having a child with a disability is a job. It's a full-time job. You have your job, and then you have your kid, and then there's this other job. so 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 again, don't feel and don't feel hesitant about bringing, having a special education advocate, or at least talking to one. You don't, again, you want to be careful to what extent you become adversarial with the school system, but you also don't want to hold back when your children need help or are being treated in a way that is less reflective of their abilities and disabilities and more reflective of someone else's bias. Right. So the example I gave of a really extraordinary, bright 6-year-old who is functioning he's in the first grade, but functioning at the 8th grade level, doing 8th grade math and reading. In his first grade classroom, he was getting up and twirling around and kind of acting up. He was also correcting his teachers, and they thought he was a behavior problem, and that's how they labeled him, and he became the little black boy with the behavior problem, and that's not okay. you know so it's really kind of, and again, I don't think that people were necessarily, I don't think it was deliberate, but they were conceptualizing him and his behavior in a way that was misguided and could potentially lead to problems. He could potentially end up, as a child classified as emotionally disturbed, when what was needed was him to have access to twice exceptional services, to be accessing gifted education, so that he's with his regular peers, but he's also being enriched and enhanced in a way that's commensurate with his intelligence, right? And that really then you're not going to see the kind of behavior problems that he might be displaying in the classroom now.
Oh, thank you for that example, and thank you for what you do. So would you say that there's a correlation between learning disability and socioeconomic status? Would you say, especially we're talking about Black and Brown families and communities, would you say that the higher socioeconomic status, the less learning disabilities? And this is why I asked that clarifying question, because you showed in one of your data that Hispanics tend to be in special ed, and it's because they're bilingual, and they have a language that they favor more. So it's a little bit,
Yeah, it's really common. So the world of so anyone can have a learning disability, right? Anyone can have a learning disability, and a learning disability just means that you have an unexpected problem with academic tasks. Usually most people have learning disabilities. 80% have reading or language-based learning disabilities. So they have difficulty with reading and with the elements of phonics, sound symbol association. That's the essence of a reading disability, is looking at a page and not being able to quickly and efficiently decode that information to be able to read it. And that can strike anyone, rich or poor. But the problem, the complication is that obviously if you have more resources, you probably are more educated about the developmental trajectory of reading disabilities. So you're probably more likely to know that when your 5-year-old is struggling in kindergarten, at the end of kindergarten, after a full year of education, and still can't recognize any letters, I think someone with a higher level of education, which usually goes along with a higher socioeconomic status, is going to say, yikes, that's a problem, right? We need to do something about this. And they're more likely to be strong advocates, right? They're more likely to then, really become involved with the school and say, oh, you need to do this, or be able to provide private tutoring that's going to supplement that child. Now, having said that, I've met plenty of, and I just did recently, folks who are coming from low socioeconomic status, who may not have a lot of education, but are just really super savvy, and they can pick up that something is wrong. They might not know what is going on, but they know something's wrong with their child, and they go straight to the doctor. But not everyone is like that. And so I think on balance, what happens when you have more education and higher, socioeconomic status, it's really about access, right? It's really about being able to get the evaluations, pay for the $1,000 this or the tutoring or the whatever, and to do it at a time when that intervention is more critical, because we know for all developmental disorders, earlier is better.
Thank you for that. I have one more question and then we will wrap up. You said something, the school is a child's job. Okay, I like that. I really do. You also identified that when a child has a disability, let's say autism, it's an extra thing. It's an extra job. Our system, our institution of learning, do they have the capacity to really meet the needs and to adequately increase the value of a child with autism so that the child would end up being successful? Is it really feasible to really do that? Especially, we identify that there's a disparity between a predominantly white community and a Black community. Okay, you see the cycle? So most institutions in the Black community don't have the resources to even engage with students that do not have disability, right? They don't have that resources. And now we are adding this extra layer. Is it really, the truth is, can we have a utopia? Or are we just going to let's talk about the honest truth.
I don't know about utopia. That might be, yeah. I mean, I wish for utopias. I don't think we're quite there yet. I think, what I'm encouraged by, as I said, is that the data on younger kids with autism, so younger African American kids with autism, there is less of a discrepancy before 6 in terms of diagnosis. So, and I don't think that was the case when I started doing this 20 years ago. I highly doubt it, because I didn't see that many African American kids, and I live in like DC. So I think that, I think schools are better at identifying kids at younger ages, especially when they have more severe symptoms, and they have better programs in place for, and it's just, just because autism is a developmental disorder. When treatments first started, when interventions started on the horizon, they really were targeted towards preschoolers and young kids in general. So we have actually somewhat less data on, what are the needs, and the needs of school age kids are variable with autism, just because autism itself is a spectrum, and you have kids that are very, very impacted, who may have extraordinary low IQs, who may even be nonverbal, to, your typical Asperger's kid. We don't use the word Asperger's anymore. It's not a diagnosis, but who are extraordinarily bright, who have high IQs, who are extremely verbal, who maybe even are socially active but odd, as opposed to the typical stereotype of autism being, delayed and withdrawn and not interested and no eye contact. We know that autism is such a big spectrum. And so I think we've done better with the younger kids. We're still struggling with the 6 and ups. And, I think that's where there needs to be some kind of continuation, because what happens is Head Start stops, or those programs, those early intervention programs stop, and then kids are funneled into the regular school system, and then they don't have what they need. So I think this is where I again love the idea of parents who have been there partnering with parents who are new in this process, and guiding them through and helping them at each stage, because development is rough. Development, the thing about adults is we're cooked, our brains are done. We don't have anything else to do up there. But the demands at 4 are different than the demands at 7, are different than demands at 11, are different than the demands at 16. And so development is not static. And so I think that's where, we need to have a better continuation from those younger ages into our school ages. And we just aren't there yet. We're working on it.
Wow. Thank you so much. So, when you say autism and autism spectrum is a developmental disorder,
Mm-hmm.
I hear a glimmer of hope. I don't know if it's because that's what you do. So are you suggesting that with aggressive intervention, health intervention, obviously, we can help these kids become successful because it's a developmental disorder? So okay.
Yeah, so absolutely. And I think we need to be sensitive to the fact that, so we have the concept of neurodiversity, right, which is really taken over, which is to say that, we don't only think of developmental disorders and particularly autism as someone with just a lot of problems or a lot of defects or a lot of deficits. That's an old way of thinking. It's a very medical model, pathological model of thinking. We're moving to a place where we see, kids that have autism, or adults that have autism, or adolescents with autism, as having a balance of strengths and weaknesses. There are things about autism that make people with autism much, they have talents that people who don't have autism, who are neurotypical, don't have. Their attention to detail, their ability to really hone in, right, and focus in on a topic of interest. There are professions where that is absolutely needed. And that attention to detail and that passion, right, about things. And that sort of brutal honesty, which sometimes in a world where we're all like, masking and covering, it's kind of nice sometimes to have people who tell it like it is, and that's often a characteristic in people with autism. But I think on the other side of that, it's not just roses and beautiful times and easygoing. We also recognize that there are challenges. There are challenges with anxiety, with depression, with executive functioning skills, with attention, school achievement. So I think success over the years, when I talk to parents, what I think of as success is, it's a lot more flexible than I think we used to be. We live in a very high-powered environment, especially here in the district, Maryland and Virginia area. Success isn't always Harvard. Success can be, I had a young man with autism who was incredibly bright, and he really struggled in university, but he was able to find a position with someone as a watchmaker, as an apprentice watchmaker, which is kind of a dying art. And his attention to detail, his ability to really focus on repairing watches and the precision, and he learned that, and it became his thing. So I think we need to just be really flexible about those ideas, and to really just keep in mind that success these days can look much different than when I was, how it was defined when I was a little girl.
Wow, I have more questions, but we've gone past the time. And I love for us to end here
Sure.
because it seems the neurodiverse patient or student brings a value to us.
They do.
It causes us to rethink things, to rethink our biases, to rethink how we define success. So I love that. I love that you come here today to share that hope that even if you're a parent with an autistic child, it's not the end.
Yeah.
The child is there to change you, to make you a better person, to make you redefine what success is. So you know what, Dr. James, this was so helpful. We're going to need you to come back again to elaborate. To elaborate on different parts, because there's just too much. It was just so much.
There's so much. There's so much. Yeah, I'm happy to come back anytime. As I said, I'm super honored. I'm so glad that you do this. It's such a service to our community. I'm so grateful for it and for you. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. James. You're just remarkable. I hope you're helping nurture more Black doctors or Black people to become like you, because we really need us to help improve us. So I thank you. I'm going to go back to announcement. Thank you again, everyone. Thank you so much. Again, this is from Healthy and Uplifted. Please join us on YouTube and Facebook. Again, Healthy and Uplifted, and also Love Your Menses. Again, know this, we now have expanded to creating a program called Love Your Menopause, because we also think that as we love our menses, we should also love our menopause. Okay, and our next webinar is going to be on December 13, 2023. It's going to be another conversation with Dr. Yvonne. We're going to be talking about staying healthy during the holidays. We'll talk about healthy eating, exercise, sleep, and mental health. Again, I have a large cohort of amazing Sister Docs that are committed to helping Love Your Menses and your health flourish, so that we can be the change that our community needs. Or if you say our community does not need to change, we could be the force that can help our community continue to thrive. When you're unsure if it is your period versus COVID, then the only way to be sure you do not have COVID is to get tested. That's a quote from Love Your Menses. So if you're not sure, please get tested. All right. And this is, you can scan this code to see where you can get a free COVID home testing kit. I have one as well. Yes, COVID is still here, especially during the winter period, whereby there's an increased rate or prevalence of upper respiratory infections. All right, awesome. I like this quote: being a mother is learning about your strengths, about strengths you didn't know you had, and dealing with fears you didn't know existed. Thank you so much for joining us. Continue to spread love and continue to be the change that you want your community to embody. Thank you. This is Dr. Azumah for Love Your Menses.